Hello, I'm Neal Shasore. I'm an architectural historian. I work on the 1920s and 30s and on architectural culture, increasingly in Imperial Britain. And very pleased to be talking about my book, Designs on Democracy, Architecture in the Public and Interwar London, as well as being an academic and an architectural historian. I run the London School of Architecture, and I'm involved in heritage bodies like 20th Century Society and the Architectural Heritage Fund. And so I suppose this book has been kind of framed by, and the work within it has been framed by my experiences in other organizations and through teaching. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the book and its contents. I wanted to kind of contextualize it within my own work. So there are two other projects I've been working on which form this kind of trilogy of new work, new perspectives on the 1920s and 30s in Britain and the Empire. So next February, I've got an edited volume co-edited with Jessica Kelly at UCA called Reconstructing, Architecture, Society and the Aftermath of the First World War, which is a series of 15 essays by academics and heritage professionals on a whole range of typologies and, I suppose, social issues and themes in social history and how they manifest themselves in architecture space in the built environment. So everything from the origins of the community centre as a typology through to the improved pubs movement by the private brewers, work on land reform, whole range of different perspectives. And then on the right is the cover of a book that I'm writing at the moment, which is a new history of 66 Portland Place for the RIBA. So that's kind of, I suppose, this book, Designs on Democracy, which I've got in physical copy here, I suppose is the kind of parent of these two other projects. I suppose I wanted to talk a little bit about the title and the cover because I took particular care over the cover and gave some thoughts to the title. So Designs on Democracy, I suppose, is trying to get at the fact that, well, to have designs on something is to seek to co-opt it in some way. And so I guess I wanted to get at the irony of the kind of emergence of a public sphere in architectural culture and architectural discourse, but the tendency of the professional architects to try to co-opt it, to try to own it. That's quite a difficult or kind of abstract idea, I suppose, to represent on a cover. And as we'll see, the way I've written the book and the way that I've illustrated it is to try to avoid all the kind of cliches of the 1920s and 30s. So, you know, the Jazz Age, Art Deco, and so on. But to try nonetheless to engage with and kind of root the architecture in a wider material and visual culture. So as I was thinking, okay, so how am I going to square this with the title Designs on Democracy, which is this kind of slightly abstract idea and kind of play on words? I was leafing through some of my research images and had completely forgotten ever having clapped eyes on the image that you can see in front of you. And this is a page in a journal, trade press journal called The National Builder, which was the organ of the National Federation of Building Trades Operatives. In 1934, within an essay, an article written about the opening of 66 Portland Place, which was the purpose-built headquarters of the Royal Institute of British Architects. And it's an image made by the great perspectivist, as the late, great Gavin Stamp called them, Raymond Myerscough Walker. And Myerscough Walker had indeed worked briefly in the office of George Gray Wernham, who was the architect of 66 Portland Place, and seems to have produced this image, which is a scraper board. So it's fine lines cut through India ink and then applied to a chalkboard surface, and then reproduced here in this journal. So I've got no idea where the original image is. I did write to the Myerscough Walker family, but to no avail. But nonetheless, we were able to reproduce this image as the cover, which I think is perfect, because what you've got is the kind of inside of 66 Portland Place. So there's a kind of clear reference, but you can't quite tell that, not necessarily, unless you're told it. It's in this state of near completion, with these scaffolding poles, and you've got these huddled figures kind of in conference, looking almost conspiratorial, in these kind of indeterminate, almost kind of like cloaks and tunics. And I think it just gets at this idea of architects being within the belly of the beast of 66 Portland Place, almost conspiring, dreaming up their designs on democracy, on the kind of world beyond, which you can see through the window. So ended up working with an architect, naturally, James Poxon of IDK, who created this incredible cover with the pink and the green, which you'll see throughout this presentation, which again, I think sort of evokes the age, evokes the 20s and 30s, this kind of like intense contrast, kind of almost quite lurid colors, but without indulging any of its cliches. The typeface is Johnston. We wanted to use a typeface called Petit Serif, which is based on a font family by the letter carver Percy Delph Smith, who did the incised lettering on the inside, on the entrance hall at 66 Portland Place, but for licensing reasons were unable to use it. So Johnston is, again, better than Gill Sands, certainly in this contemporary moment. But I suppose, the reason I kind of, labor on the cover and on the design of the cover is not only, as I say, does it, I think, speak to kind of the strategy, the approach to writing history, and kind of how you illustrate, how you animate that, which is, to be quite immersive. But I think a lot of the book is about design reform, and about a kind of attitude to design, a sort of holism. And I felt, therefore, that the book, the kind of artifact, really kind of had to speak to that, had to be part of that world that, in a way, I was trying to conjure, even if it is otherwise quite an academic book. So this is the structure of the book. There's an introduction, quite a long introduction, and then I guess 5 substantive chapters, and then a very long conclusion, which tries to kind of pull lots of these themes together. And what I tried to do with the chapter titles was to find words that evoked the period, that were kind of common in architectural discourse. If you kind of listen carefully to the language and to the conversations that you can find in journals, in correspondence, and so on. But again, avoiding any of the familiar cliches, and indeed trying to find words which you wouldn't necessarily think were architectural. And so propaganda, slump, machine craft, quite an unusual one, vigilance, manners, these are all words that as you read through the columns of the architectural press of the period, you come across all the time. And what I've tried to do with those words is align them to different facets of the public realm and architectural culture. Because what the book really tries to do is describe and analyze this quite excitable architectural culture in the interwar years, somewhat at odds with the sort of insular parochialism with which we normally associate the period. So it's trying to show that however little we might like the architecture, and I'm at pains to emphasize that a lot of the architecture that I write about, a lot of the people that I write about in this book are not people that I hugely admire, are not buildings necessarily that I think are the finest quality of their age, but they happened. And I think also what happened in the 1920s and 30s in relation to architecture, in relation not only to design, but to discourse, media, and representation, to ideas and ideals of practice and professionalism, I think was significant and very much shapes the architectural culture that we've inherited today. So it looks at different facets of that architectural culture and of architectural culture's public realm, and each of the titles relates to one of those, as you'll see shortly. So I thought I'd go through each of the chapters and give you a flavor of what's in all of them. And the best place to start is with the introduction, which is subtitled "Reconstructing the Profession for a Democratic Age." So the book lands you in 1930, in May 1930, at the Architectural Association, because Eric Mendelssohn, probably the most famous modernist architect of the day, had come to London for the first time at the invitation of the AA, and his visit was much vaunted by the great and the good of the architectural profession at that time. There was an exhibition, as you can see on this image in the AA archives, of some of the more expressionist studies that he produced in the late 1910s. And he came to give a lecture at the AA, probably in this room, though without the table setting, to this kind of packed audience of all the great and good, as I say, of the architectural profession. And he came to kind of, sort of like Moses with the tablets, to kind of proclaim the sort of laws of modernist architecture. And I kind of land on this vignette because I think it reveals a lot about architectural culture at this time, which we've missed. First of all, that people in Britain were not really interested in what was happening on the continent, and that modernism was purely this kind of foreign import. Well, it's interesting that at this event you've got art classicists and traditionalists, you've got neo-Georgians, you've got people interested in kind of in more modern forms of visual and architectural expression, all in the same room, all in dialogue with one another. And I think it's a really kind of evocative anecdote, evocative tableau, I should say, that shows that. But also, there are some other kind of accounts or perspectives on what happened that evening. There were two people in the audience from seemingly either side of the architectural debate. A journalist and editor called Frederick Towndrow, Tony Towndrow, who was the first editor of Architectural Design and Construction, which later became AD, who wrote a book called Architecture in the Balance, which was about scientific humanism, as he called it, about kind of extolling the virtues of modernist architecture. And then another journalist and critic called Arthur Tristan Edwards, known as Tristan Edwards, who certainly now is often held up as the kind of arch conservative and traditional voice, in a sense, an exemplary voice of the sort of insularity and parochialism of British architectural culture at this time. And there's an editorial in Building, which says, after Mendelssohn's talk, Towndrow and Edwards get into this spat, no one else gets a chance to talk, and so eventually the editor of Building says, look, why don't you write, engage in a correspondence, hammer this out between you, and we'll publish it in Building. And over, I think, a number of months, over 6 or 7 months, there's an exchange of letters about the virtues of modernism versus the virtues of traditional styles in architecture. And I hold this up as an example of this kind of performative polemicism, which pits one side against the other. And, we know, of course, that there are other iterations of this, in particular in the 1970s, strangely kind of coming back into architectural discourse at the moment. And I use this to kind of actually challenge the idea that it's really much more than rhetoric. Because, of course, as the vignette has demonstrated, everybody's actually talking to one another. Everybody's engaging quite seriously, really, with what Mendelssohn is saying. And they're part of this kind of highly engaged, sometimes, passionately charged architectural discourse. And if you look very carefully, even at the so-called polarized debate between Edwards and Towndrow, actually, there's quite a lot of common ground between them. And one of the central questions, it seems to me, is how do we get the public to care about architecture, to engage in architecture, but critically, to go back to the title, to care about architects and to respect the expertise and value of architects. So the introduction in that sense tries to unseat the prevailing narrative about architecture in the 1920s and 30s, which was that it was all about style, and it was all about a kind of revival of the Victorian battle of the styles, and that it was all terribly insular and parochial, when actually, as this opening vignette shows, there's this really kind of supercharged debate about the nature of architecture and what architecture needs to be to meet the newly articulated demands of a mass democracy. So, having introduced that vignette, I then talk about, I suppose, this idea of a public realm of architectural culture at this time. And I try to argue that really, once again, forgetting about apparently polarized debates around style, actually, the thing that we need to understand and the thing that we need to unpack is that there was quite a broad liberal consensus about the nature of architectural professionalism and about architecture. And I think this image of caricatures of a RIBA banquet in the new building at 66 Portland Place in 1934, I think gets at that liberal consensus, that cozy liberal consensus about architecture and about architectural culture really well. Here you've got, again, all the great and good of the architectural world in white tie at a banquet in their club. Cited in their new clubhouse. You've got the figure of Lutyens there in the foreground, Ernest Berry Weber to his right, one of the kind of great architects of town halls and civic amenity at this time. Behind them, Gray Wernham, the architect of the building. You've got Goodhart Rendell, you've got Percy Thomas there, you've got Charles Holden, and you've got senior figures within the kind of senior mandarins of the RIBA, Ian McAllister puffing on a cigar in the foreground, two behind him, Edward Carter, Bobby Carter, the librarian of the RIBA. So I think this just captures the fact that there was this rather cozy liberal consensus that encompassed the so-called avant-garde, more often than not, of modernist architects, and indeed architects kind of more culturally and politically to the right. And I suppose what I'm trying to get at there is that in terms of the kind of radical positions on the production of the built environment, on ideas, for instance, of architectural labor, on the role of the state in procuring buildings, these are quite significant conversations, actually, within professional discourse at the time. There is nonetheless this rather cozy consensus. And so I try to kind of set up that really what we're doing in the book is critiquing this whole idea of kind of this prevalent liberal consensus. And then I go back in time again, I suppose, and talk about 1917. So I talk about the kind of beginning of this period of the interwar interwar years, thinking about how a great debate about reconstruction, how to repair not so much the physical damage as happened after World War II, but the kind of social and economic repair should happen, and what the role of architecture, the architect, the profession should be in the project of reconstruction. And of course, as I've shown you, you kind of warm to that theme in the edited volume that Jessica and I have put together, that there was a sense of a project of reconstruction, a kind of metaphorical reconstruction in which architecture, land, and the built environment played a significant role. But anyway, in the context of this book, I talk about the kind of excited debates happening at the RIBA among the kind of reformists at that time, who convene a Future of Architecture committee, sounds terribly 21st century, and who issue a questionnaire to the profession, trying to elicit new and dynamic ideas about how the profession might organize it itself, how the institute might reform itself. They moan about how the young can't keep abreast of technological changes, the uselessness of the RIBA, the fact that they've got no voice in Parliament. Some, again, really kind of contemporary sounding concerns, eerily contemporary, I think. And they issued this questionnaire, and we don't have record of any of the responses to it, except by one architect called John Murray, who was effectively a surveyor to the Crown Estate, and who had been at that time giving quite a lot of attention to the rebuilding of Regent Street and kind of driving up the value of Crown land in central urban areas, in particular in London. Anyway, he comes back with this rather interesting diagram illustrating the union of the art of architecture and allied sciences and arts in this kind of tholos, temple-like structure, though you'll notice that there are very few ways of getting in and out. So I kind of read it as much as a kind of Benthamite panopticon, with the art of architecture at the center, BC 6000, the RIBA at its heart within this kind of this peristyle, and then all the different kind of compartments or departments of professional life, so that you've got everything from the Concrete Institute and the British Fire Prevention Committee to the Arts and Crafts Society and the Society of British Sculptors, and the Town Planning Institute alongside the London Society. And I find this diagram really fascinating, because I think it shows the kind of richness and multifaceted nature of professional life, which in a sense architectural history, or histories of architecture in the built environment, have failed to capture. This kind of interconnectedness, the fact that, you know, the professional architect, even at this time, saw, rather than the kind of hedonism of sort of pure design and being obsessed with style and classicism versus traditionalism. No, just like today, practice was concerned with fire prevention, with new materials, with craft and ornamentation alongside sanitation and hygiene. So I just kind of include this as, I suppose, an index of the sort of professional brain of the period, but actually, I suppose, a challenge, historiographical challenge, about the sorts of histories that we might start to write, that we might start to produce, and how those might be more relevant, in a sense, to contemporary practice and professionalism, certainly to the kinds of students that we teach at the LSA. So I mentioned that each chapter has this kind of, I guess, this kind of key word that's supposed to evoke the discourse of the period. That's then allied to a particular project or event in architectural culture, itself allied to some facet of the public realm, some idea of publicness. And so we start with propaganda, thinking about the nature of publicity, both the kind of making public of something, which is, I guess, what publicity literally means, as well as its connection to the wider world of advertising, and a great debate that happens about the nature of advertising professional services. And a lot of these ideas weirdly come to a head at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley, which runs between 1924 and 1926. And again, the chapter lands you in the International Advertising Conference of 1924, which was held at the British Empire exhibition in Wembley, which I guess it was a kind of major event in the history of advertising. It was the first time the International Advertising Conference had met outside of North America, but it again sort of engaged this wider world of design reform. I'm very interested in a figure called Lawrence Weaver, who was the sort of impresario of the British Empire exhibition at Wembley, who had been architectural editor at Country Life, and had kind of run the rural reconstruction scheme through the Ministry of Agriculture, built houses for small holdings, and then became Director General of UK exhibits at the British Empire exhibition at Wembley. And he kind of participates in this conference. This is my way in. I kind of quite like, as I've indicated, this kind of quite immersive way of writing, of storytelling. And this wonderful poster by F.C. Herrick for the Baynard Press is produced called Truth in Advertising. And Herrick designed the lion motif for the Empire exhibition, which you can see on the right. So just include these two posters, again, because I think what I try to do in the book is situate architecture in relation to a wider visual and material culture. I think that's really vital. This is the Empire exhibition at Wembley. You can see the half the kind of great ellipsis of the old Wembley Stadium and the two twin towers. Oh, sorry, the twin towers there. I'm interested in these huge concrete hangars designed by John Simpson and Maxwell Ayrton, which contain the Palace of Industry and the Palace of Engineering, i.e. the UK exhibits. And I talk a lot about the kind of, I suppose, three-dimensional advertising of those exhibits, coordinated by the figure of Lawrence Weaver, who's adamant that he works with architects and creates this sort of Wembley panel, as he calls it, of young guns in the profession. So people like Joseph Emberton, Oliver Hill, Edward Morth, Austin Hall, people that later on we tend to think of as kind of quite conservative architects, not in the case of Emberton and Hill, but again, who were part of this sort of quite excitable architectural culture in the 1920s. And Weaver, they're really their kind of significant patron. And I suppose I use Weaver and I use the advertising convention and the Empire exhibition to talk about this kind of nexus, this place where advertising and architecture meet. And that in turn opens up a huge debate about whether the professional should be advertising at all, should be involved in this kind of grubby world of commerce, because of course the professional ideal is one sort of outside the market, beyond the kind of base concerns and machinations of the market. But in this new democratic age, where architects have to show that they can add value, that they can mean something to the public and to public life, have to, as it were, get their hands dirty by engaging with industry, engaging with commerce, engaging with a great imperial exhibition to which 17 million people came within the first season alone, showing what they can do, showing how they can bring I suppose, flair and coherence and holism to a built environment. Clark Williams Ellis was the kind of leader of this Wembley panel, and you can see his designs for Coulton China, and also these kind of ornamental columns with devices at their summit, which were peppered around the exhibition site. Second chapter is called Slump, Public Relations and the Building World. And the reason I use this word slump is because, of course, one of the great cliches of the 20s and 30s is that they were characterized by the Great Slump or the Great Depression, of mass unemployment. And that's a really kind of enduring image, isn't it, of the 1920s and 30s. And it's one that's often evoked in writing about this period in relation to architecture. But there isn't a huge amount of kind of analysis of what the sort of cultural dynamics or cultural economic dynamics were that emerged from this sort of seismic economic event. Imagine what that might feel like in the 20s. And so it's probably, well, I wonder, I hope some of you, after hearing this talk, might read this book. It's one of these chapters where it's probably the most boring to read, but is the chapter that weirdly I feel most proud of writing. It talks about the remedial efforts that the profession made as the effects of the Great Slump worsened on the construction industry. So certainly by the early 1930s, kind of mass unemployment in the construction industry, the economic turbulence leads to a kind of economy campaign, the abandonment of major capital projects and public works, and this starts to affect very directly the architectural profession. And it affects the kind of the kind of politics, I suppose, also of professionalism, so that you get the voice of the salaried architect, of architectural workers, starting to come through very loud and clear. Again, I think really interesting parallels with what is happening now with the Future Architects Front and the amazing work they're doing in drawing attention to architectural labour, to wages, the election of Moiwa as president of the RIBA. There's this kind of extraordinary parallelism between the 1920s and 30s and now. So what this chapter tries to do is talk about what figures in the architectural world do to try to mitigate the worst effects of the Great Slump on the wider construction industry and on the architecture profession. And essentially what happens is Raymond Unwin, the great architect of the Garden City movement, the master planner of the first garden city at Letchworth, of Hampstead Garden Suburb, at this time president of the RIBA, comes up with a plan, pulls together a conference of not only architects, but a whole range of professionals and tradespeople within the built environment to say, so what are we going to do about this? And they form effectively the first construction industry lobbying group called the Building Industries National Council. And right at the heart of the Building Industries National Council's work is a public relations committee. And so this is really the birth of PR in architecture and construction. And what happens is they use the Building Industries National Council to start to advocate for Keynesian investment in public works and to kind of try to stimulate the home market and cut through to government to make the case to get building again. And I find that really interesting because the terms in which they do this are, the architecture profession seeks to catalyze this, are almost Ruskinian. They're about the ways in which the architect relates to the wider construction industry. And so I talk a lot about how kind of Unwin's Ruskinian ideals, of course, carefully nuanced by Mark Swennerton in Artisans and Architects, a fabulous book written in the 1980s. So I try to be nuanced about it, but how those kind of Ruskinian ideals kind of inform Unwin's attempt to get the country building again, and what that tells us about how architects configure themselves in the wider building world. And critically, I kind of come back to this idea about the kind of line between professionalism and actually how you kind of collectively advertise your service to the nation and to the public. So the chapter talks a lot about the Building Industries National Council, and then it talks about what the impact of the Building Industries National Council's work is on the RIBA, which is to create a public relations committee and appoint its first public relations officer, a man called Eric Bird. The work of the Public Relations Committee is not particularly well known. Why would it be? Formed in 1933, but actually it does amazing things. It forges links with the documentary film movement, with Paul Rother, who puts together a report with, I think, some consultation of John Grierson to think about architectural themes in documentary filmmaking. It advocates for the creation of housing panels to produce cheap but reliable designs to mitigate the worst effects of sprawl. It advocates for statutory protection of function. Of course, the Architects Registration Act is passed in 1931. So it's doing this sort of extraordinary work to try to advocate for the profession and to make it more relevant for the public. And critically, too, it engages not only the kind of the familiar sort of grandees of architectural culture, but also the sort of the young guns. So you've got people like Max Fry, Basil Ward, Elizabeth Denby, all participating in the work of the RIBA Public Relations. Function, which I argue is a really significant shift in architectural culture. And I suppose this is just a pamphlet produced by the Building Industries National Council, The Case Against Economy, produced by the Special Committee for Public Relations, chaired by the architect Howard Robertson, the BINC chaired by Raymond Unwin, as I mentioned. There are no illustrations in this chapter, as I say. It's probably the least visually compelling, but I think you know, a kind of a story for our time. And that leads on to the next chapter, which is called Machinecraft, Forging Public Institutions. So again, trying to find these unusual words and phrases in architectural discourse, and then trying to think about these different facets of the public. This one looking at the idea of the public or semi-public institution. Because of course, this is the great age of the semi-public institution. You've got things like the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, which 4 years later, in 1926, becomes the British Broadcasting Corporation, that builds Broadcasting House just down the road from the RIBA. You've got things like the formation of the London Passenger Transport Board, what we know as London Underground under Frank Pick, and the kind of great architectural patronage of Charles Holden, not only at 55 Broadway, but along the Piccadilly line and along the Northern line. You've got the kind of evolution of the Port of London Authority. You've got the General Post Office producing the kind of ubiquitous and iconic red telephone box designed by Giles Gilbert Scott. This is a sort of age of making and remaking public institutions and semi-public institutions. And what I argue is that the RIBA tries to kind of become a semi-public institution. It tries to pose as one architecturally, but also in the kind of advocacy that it does for the wider profession. But I use this word machinecraft, which doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue, but was an expression that was not necessarily popularized, but certainly forged by the critic and kind of public relations man, John Gloag, who also wrote historical fiction and popular books about architecture, and a historian of furniture and design. And Gloag was also very active in the Design and Industries Association. And the DIA, I suppose, as Alan Powers has written a little bit about in his brilliant book Bauhaus Goes West, which came out a couple of years ago, the DIA was sort of Britain's answer to the Bauhaus. and was in dialogue, I think, with really significant debates about design reform, both in Germany and in Scandinavia, and specifically in Sweden. And I suppose I use machine crafts to pull together this thinking about the nature of design reform, architecture's relationship to industrial design, to commercial art, that has really been kind of running through these first chapters of the book. In the British Empire exhibition at Wembley, Lawrence Weaver, another really significant figure in the Design and Industries Association, and arguably contained within the kind of attitude to public relations espoused and charted in the second chapter. So machinecraft is John Gloag's word, but I use it because I think it captures this attempt, as Michael Saylor wrote about nearly 30 years ago in the avant-garde in interwar England. It captures this resolution of the kind of Ruskinian, Mauritian ideal of craft, of handcraft, of joy in labor, with the machine, the forces of industrialization, and I would argue also the kind of forces of professionalization. So the machine as a kind of double metaphor, and machine crafts, this sort of very kind of aggressive, I think, alloy, I think speaks really well to the sort of slightly uncomfortable attempt at reconciling the machine with the ideal of craft, with of professionalism, with the ideal of art. And that's why I use it to explore 66 Portland Place. So this chapter offers a new reading of 66 Portland Place, designed by George Gray Wernham, who was a neighbor of Lawrence Weaver and a great friend of John Gloag. And so I really see the book almost in two halves, and this chapter is the kind of pulls together all the themes that have been explored in the first half of the book. So I try to offer this new reading of 66 Portland Place, the kind of heart of architectural culture at this time under the aegis of the RIBA, in slightly more dynamic terms. To connect it to this wider design reform movement, to show Wernham again as somebody engaged in a wider architectural discourse. What I failed to mention earlier was that when Mendelssohn came to visit the AA, it was during the presidency of Gray Wernham, and the Wernhams became great friends with the Mendelssohns. So again, just thinking about these sometimes quite surprising relationships, interconnections within and out with British architectural culture. So I talk about the design of 66 Portland Place, and I talk about it being this kind of machine for the bureaucracy of the professional body. And I talk about some of the really quite profound changes that are happening to the way that the RIBA kind of operates and thinks about itself. So there's a focus on the creation of the library, the collaboration between the architect and the librarian, to create this kind of new conception of not just a library, but an information bureau as this almost kind of technocracy of architecture. And I talk about some of the links also between the RIBA and another new institution of the period, which was the Building Centre. And Katie Lloyd-Thomas has done incredible work about the history of the specification and the kind of history of the Building Centre. And I try to just connect some of the dots between what she's saying and the kind of world that I'm describing, because you have this sort of fascinating situation in which the Building Centre, which grew out of the AA Materials Bureau, was very closely connected to this project for the RIBA, in the sense that the founding directors of the Building Centre included Robert Atkinson, the architect Robert Atkinson, who was one of the competition assessors for the RIBA, Maurice Webb, son of Aston Webb, who was chair of the Premises Committee for the RIBA, and Gray Wernham, who was selected, surprise, surprise, from an open international empire-wide competition. Gray Wernham got the job. And so it's a really important sort of prism, I think, through which to understand the RIBA competition and resulting projects. So I talk a little bit, as I say, about this kind of wider world of design reform and the international links that characterize it. 66 Portland Place, certainly the kind of design of the elevations is often said to be derived from Gunnar Asplund's library in Stockholm. Actually, I think it's much closer to Ivar Tengbom's concert hall in Stockholm, and this image of the foyer on the right of the concert hall in Stockholm, I think kind of shows this really well, that there are definitely echoes of this in the Florence Hall at the RIBA. You can make out the kind of ornamental plaster relief on the ceiling. You can look at this sort of inlay and the pattern of the flooring that's very much echoed in 66 Portland Place, the kind of decorated piers, the etched glass, and so on. So I'm kind of interested in the connections between Sweden, Stockholm in particular, and architectural culture in Britain at this time through figures like Wernham. This is just a slightly wonky image of the building centre. Not only was Wernham a director, but he also had some hand in designing its spaces. So he collaborated on the design of the ground floor, and you can see the inquiries desk off to the left, and then some of the displays of new materials, craft and ornamentation also very much part of the building centre. Displays of empire timbers, about which I've spoken and written elsewhere, and which carries into the specification of 66 Portland Place. I'll speed up a bit because I'm conscious of time. Vigilance, chapter 4, preservationism and a proprietary public, talks about how this sort of world of conservation and preservationism also gets cast in terms of the public, and in terms of sort of public ownership, in terms of a kind of public inheritance. But also, I mean, the word vigilance is often evoked in terms of actually sexual impropriety in the 19th century. It's used in sort of anti-child and sex trafficking campaigns, and then gets used quite a lot in architectural discourse. So you get a springing up of architectural vigilance societies, and the language of vigilance really permeates preservationist debates at this time. So I thought it was quite an interesting word to use. I suppose what this chapter does is it talks about a sort of series of preservationist debates, some of which are very familiar. So the great clamour about the preservation of Regent Street, or the failure to preserve Regent Street, Nash's Regent Street, which is effectively pulled down and replaced with commercial architecture for the Crown Estate, you know, in a sense for perfectly sensible commercial reasons. It talks a little bit about that. But what I wanted to focus on in this context was, because the chapter talks about the birth of the Georgian group, but what I try to do is tell a different story about Georgian preservationism, and a different and the kind of sort of alternative history of the origins of, you know, our kind of modern system of preservationism, and I do that through this particular episode relating to Portland Town. This is a spread from the Architectural Review in 1938 called "Shut Us Up in Portland Town," written by a journalist called Ralph Parker, who was actually a communist and died in the Soviet Union. Which itself is interesting because the Communist Party got very interested in this and were very active in this campaign to preserve a working class district on the periphery of St. John's Wood of what were called sort of early 19th century artisanal cottages. And it's a campaign that is championed by the Londoners' League, run by this rather strange couple called Philip and Dorothy Warren Trotter, who operated out of this house, 122 Maida Vale, the other half of which was bought, interestingly, by Lord Palumbo's father, who pulled it down. And then they rechristened their house. The Trotters rechristened their house the Mutilated House, and this became the headquarters of the Londoners' League. And they got very involved in preserving what they called the kind of sociological, horticultural, kind of cultural life of what they described as little Londons, not just the kind of heroic monuments of the Georgian period and indeed of earlier periods. And so I use this, as I say, to kind of complicate narratives about Georgian preservationism specifically, but about the kind of histories of preservation in general, kind of more bottom up rather than top down. So these are some images sort of showing this, I think quite evocative images taken by the documentary photographer Margaret Monk, which were used to illustrate this piece in the Architectural Review. Amazingly, they've been donated to the Museum of London, and I found them completely by chance and sort of recognized these images that had been reproduced in this edition of the Architectural Review. And I think the image on the right sort of evoking what was called the overflatting of St. John's Wood, these kind of luxury apartment blocks built for the middle classes that you start to see dotted around the place. These more images by Margaret Monk kind of showing this social life. I think this is the rate collector on the right, and then a John Bunyan who claimed descent from the author Bunyan, a grocer in Portland town. This showing the kind of backs of the streets and showing again, this is sort of Jane Jacobs stuff, right? But decades earlier. And I think this is really useful in kind of complicating some of our narratives and assumptions about preservationism. Manners, public propriety and civic design really focuses on this guy, Arthur Tristan Edwards, a very strange but I think interesting Welsh-born architect, planner and critic, and who worked in the Ministry of Health Housing Division with Raymond Unwin, but hated Unwin, I think, and hated the Garden City and advocated for urbanity, in particular for low-rise, high-density housing, was a really significant influence on Thomas Sharp, on Gibbard, on Gordon Cullen, was well known by figures in the mid-century, much less well known now, though I'm sure there are people watching this who've heard of him. He sort of pops up in the strangest of places. Rallied against or railed against, I should say, the sort of Americanization or the kind of skyscrapering of the built environment as he saw it. And this image, illustrations from his 1924 book, Good and Bad Manners in Architecture, illustrates that really well. He was trained as a mathematician and a classicist at the University of Oxford before studying civic design at the University of Liverpool under Charles Riley, Stanley Adshead and Patrick Abercrombie. Produced this chart trying to sort of debunk myths about unorthodoxies in contemporary housing policy. So this was to show that you could vary the width of streets according to the direction of the street and at different, and the kind of light and air across the year, basically trying to argue for, I suppose, richer morphological possibilities than he felt the sort of increasingly standardized approach to housing, in particular for social housing for working class communities, was allowing. Edwards is one of these figures that then got very much championed by the New Right in the 70s, by Roger Scruton, by David Watkin and so on. But actually was a Labour voter, was a young Fabian, was engaged in heterodox economics, got very involved in the social credit movement, was very closely aligned to liberal Anglicans who advocated really for the kind of proto-welfare state, was also engaged, as many of those people were, in the positive eugenics movement. And so I try to tell a story about his campaigning vehicle from the 1930s, the 100 New Towns Association, connected to these other movements, which advocated for 100 new compact towns dotted around the country. You can see how he proposes to do that. Particular emphasis on coastal communities and on coastal revival. He later became very involved with the Corporation of Hastings and talked bitterly later in life about the Second Battle of Hastings, with which he was engaged. Anyway, this chapter just tries to, I suppose, tell, again, a sort of counter history and alternative history of housing, particularly through low-rise high-density housing, again, sort of weirdly prescient, I think, of the moment that we're in now. I think that there's some interesting parallels with the work of some of our kind of most interesting housing architects today, Peter Barber among them, and also with the kind of boldness of proposition contained within Edwards's work. And these are just some examples from the 100 New Towns for Britain campaign, adapted to different topographies. And then showing, I mean, really advocating for a sort of neo-Georgian, neo-Regency language in kind of quadrangular formation and terraces. He was very, you can see some kind of contemporary prejudices about sunlight and air with these kind of roof gardens. Very interested in the recess of services. He argued against what he called the fatal doctrine of the priority of the plan. He's very kind of strongly anti-modernist. You'll recall me talking about him as the interlocutor, as the combatant against Frederick Toundrow after Mendelssohn's talk. And so again, I use Edwards, I suppose, to complicate some easy binaries between, modernism and political progressivism versus traditionalism and conservatism operating in architectural culture at this time. These just some images from a post-war publication called Modern Terrace Housing. Became quite interested in the pyramidal section. And I know that Edwards's books were circulating around people like Leslie Martin and Patrick Hodgkinson. So I think in the DNA of some of the low-rise high-density housing experiments of the 1970s is some of Tristan Edwards' thinking, often unrecognized. And then finally, as I said, a long conclusion, an essay, I suppose, about the architectural mind and topographical projections on the public realm. This focuses on kind of this sort of febrile focus on development in central London, in particular involving cross-river communication, namely at Charing Cross and at Waterloo, and the space between them, especially on the south bank of the river, because of course the kind of political geography of London had, and I haven't talked much about the role that London plays in the book, had shifted with the erection of Ralph Nott's County Hall on the Surrey side of the river by Westminster Bridge. I suppose the coincidence of the structural failure of John Rennie's Waterloo Bridge, evoked wonderfully here in an article from the Illustrated London News with the Labour leader of the London County Council, Herbert Morrison, prizing off the bricks, the first blocks of Waterloo Bridge in 1934, it having been showing quite serious signs of sinking since 1923, to usher in a kind of new modern public amenity in the form of a new Waterloo Bridge. You can see images of the wobbly bridge here, a man kind of poking at the balustrading, the causes of subsidence. Another article from the Illustrated London News on the right. These incredible images from Historic England's archive of the slow unbuilding of Waterloo Bridge, block by block, brick by brick, the scattering of its relics across the empire, There are bits of baluster at Eltham Palace, in Bulawayo Municipal Park, granite slabs in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand. It becomes this sort of relic of the imperial, of the kind of body of the imperial metropolis. And I try to evoke this kind of idea of romance, ruin, and relic. Some more images here of the kind of extraordinary engineering feats, let alone anything else, of demolishing Old Waterloo Bridge. This is one of my favorite images in the book of two gentlemen looking at the sort of monumental three-quarter engaged double Doric piers that characterize the design of the old bridge, and then Giles Gilbert Scott's proposals for a new bit of public amenity. This, the pylon scheme of 1934, rejected. This, the final design that we know and in some cases love. And I talk a little bit about the sort of structural games being played, the sort of representationalism, I suppose, of Scott's design, which I think is more sophisticated, again, than the sort of historicism with which we normally kind of tarnish the names of a lot of these architects. Again, whether we like it or not aesthetically, something more sophisticated, something more interesting going on. And I try to evoke that in this chapter. But I talk a lot about proposals for the removal of John Hawkshaw's Hungerford Railway Bridge, described by the radical politician John Burns as that ugly red oxide behemoth which sprawls from south to north. It was hated by the architectural community, a favourite campaign of the early London Society, and seen as a kind of opportunity, as I say, to kind of really shape the south side, the Surrey side of the river and the South Bank. So this is an image by the ecclesiastical architect W.D. Carrow from 1917, proposing the removal of Charing Cross railway station to the south side of the river to create a new southern railway terminus called Wipers in response to Waterloo, so a kind of new memorial railway station, creating this sort of circular place. The ecclesiastical commissioners for whom Carrow worked owned vast swathes of what we now know as the South Bank, and so I think was kind of speculating on what you might be able to do there. And I'm just racing through a whole range of proposals, including by Edwin Lutyens, who made himself deeply unpopular with the RIBA by getting involved in designs that accepted the removal of Waterloo Bridge, against which the RIBA campaigned vociferously. Various other proposals. These, the results of a London County Council commission, designs by people like Reginald Bloomfield, by Giles Gilbert Scott, by Max Fry and Thomas Adams. And I suppose what I'm interested in and what I try to argue for is the huge kind of energy and public, very public debate, not just a sort of trade discussion about how to remake kind of inner urban London at this time and what the role of the architect was in doing so. So there's quite a lot of argument in the conclusion of the book about the role of the architect planner. Again, something that we probably tend to associate with the post-war years, but was definitely a kind of position that was being fought over at this time, in particular in relation to this sort of ideal of civic design, which is another sort of running theme of the book. And the book climaxes really with talking about the Royal Academy Planning Committee's proposals for reconstruction after World War II. So if the book begins with reconstruction after World War I, it takes you right to, I suppose, the dawn of the post-war era and how this architectural culture kind of ends up giving way, of course, to a much bolder, much more radical modernist thinking. But it tries to say that nonetheless, these figures remain active, certainly remain thinking, and are probably trying to do something more sophisticated than perhaps we previously understood. That may be so, and again, I certainly don't advocate for the kind of Beaux-Arts tradition of planning, of architecture, or indeed education. But it happened, and in my view, the job of the historian, the job of the architectural historian, is not simply to write histories of taste, and certainly of one's particular taste, but to give a kind of rounded account of the whole picture of debates and discourse and practice involved in the production of the built environment, and that's broadly speaking what I've tried to do. So thank you very much for listening, and I very much hope this hasn't put you off the prospect of engaging with my book, Designs on Democracy, Architecture and the Public in Interwar London.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was an incredibly thorough presentation. I feel like I learned a lot just by listening to that. And I did have one question, maybe just myself, but yeah. I'm curious how a lot of the things that you mentioned kind of talked about this parallel about what was happening in the time and the context of the book, and then what's happening now. And yeah. I'm curious how what you learned from writing the book translates into your role into the LSA, or if it's completely separate.
No, I see them as really contiguous. Probably more than as it were other people might be willing to accept. I think that because in a sense the book sort of has followed me around really for 10 years. It's been 10 years in the making, and I was finishing my PhD, which sort of forms the basis of this book. I mean, it's been completely rewritten. I finished my PhD whilst I was working at the RIBA, and kind of was like this sort of incredibly unfashionable, untimely subject that I was working on for itself for a whole set of complex psychological reasons. I was like, what? We're talking, really? We're worried about all these things? These were exactly the conversations that were happening 100 years ago. And so I suppose it's prompted me to think about why that is, why so, in a sense, so little has changed. What are some of the kind of epistemic and sort of fundamental issues in architecture that mean that the kind of discursive dial really doesn't shift? So I have found it hugely informative for how I think about contemporary practice and professionalism. The LSA is trying to say something about the nature of contemporary practice and professionalism. So in a sense, I feel I owe this book and I owe this project everything in that regard, because it fundamentally has shaped how I think about architectural education, architectural practice and professionalism, and therefore the kinds of projects and ideas that I'm trying to push through my role here. So it's not quite a remove, but it's sort of definitely there. And there are these strange wider kind of resonances, which in a sense seem to be getting stronger and stronger. So I hope that people might read it and find it stimulates ideas about our contemporary moment. I don't, sort of spoon feed them through the book. In a way, I've tried to make those connections when I talk publicly about it now, because I think architects may find it interesting for that reason. So yeah, no, great question. Thank you.
Yeah, I think from what I can see at the LSA from friends who study there and people who teach there, that what you talk about in the book I can definitely see the link, which is why I found it quite fascinating as you were talking. Like, it really feels like a whole rather than these separate. And
yeah, completely. Well, I'm glad that came across. Thank you.